We have a leak coming out of our cam seal, so we're going to replace that today. The first step is going to be to remove the VTEC entire mechanism, including the spool valve, and put a video link in the comments that shows you how to do that. That's the video where I show how to replace the gasket that goes around here anyways. So you can refer to that to take this off. The next step is going to be to remove the valve cover. To remove the valve cover, we start by removing all of the 10 nuts that you can see, or bolts you can see on the top. There are 8 nuts that are going to be in these positions right here, and then there are 2 bolts, one holding this bracket in place and one that was holding the ground wire here. 10mm socket will get you all of those. Once you have removed these 4 nuts, you can take off this decorative piece of plastic, and then there are 4 more nuts under here that are 10mm we're going to pull off. Under each of these nuts that actually seal the valve cover in place, there is a washer here. So this washer actually you can pull off too. You're going to pull that off and set that aside. Once you've removed all of those nuts, bolts, and washers, disconnect this line right here. Take off the filler cap. Just gives you an extra place to kind of reach in and grab the cover, and then you'll be able to pull the cover off. You can leave all this in place. We're just going to kind of flip this over and set it to the side and leave all these there. So now that the valve cover is off and just flipped over to the side right there, we need to remove this front rail right here. These are all 12mm bolts, but the ones with the big bolt length sticking out, you're of course going to need a deep socket for. At the very far end of the rail, there are 2 10mm bolts as well. Once all of the bolts are removed, you can just remove the rail. We'll set it aside. Once the rail is off, remove these 2 10mm bolts right here. After these 10mm bolts are removed, you can take this entire piece off. It might not seem like it moves. It might seem under tight. So just put a flatheader pry bar right here, and you can just move and you'll see that the whole thing just comes up. Once you've taken that piece off, you'll be able to see the old cam seal. You might have to have worked at it to get this off. I mean, this one was way overdone with Honda Bond, all this gray stuff. You do not need to put all of that in there. So that was actually contributing to the leak, just too much Honda Bond. The next step is to clean up this area really nicely on this side and on the underside of the piece that was removed to make sure that we have a clean surface for the new cam seal. Here we have a new seal that we're going to put in, OEM Honda seal. You can see the part number here, and this just gets installed right where the other one was. It's just going to slip in right here. We're just going to put a small amount of Honda Bond or gray Permatex right along the bottom edge and seat it in there, not too much. So here you see we just have this thin smear of Permatex Ultra Gray right there, and we're just going to now set this back in place. We're going to set everything back in place, and initially when we put all the bolts in, we'll just hand tighten them lightly just to keep everything in place. So the cover and then the cam rail right here. It's going to set in place, and then we'll set all the bolts in, and we're just going to do them by hand. We'll torque them down in a little bit. Once you've got all the bolts back in place, you'll go back on with your torque wrench. All these 12mm bolts in the middle are going to go to 20 foot-pounds, and then the 10mm ones on the end are just going to be 7 foot-pounds. Once your bolts are all back on, you can put your valve cover back on. Make sure you clean up all these edges with a razor blade so they're nice and clean. Then you're going to put a pea-sized drop of Honda Bond or gray RTV into each of these little right angle corners on both sides of the cam. Once we have the valve cover back in place, we're just going to tighten up the bolts. They're only going to go to 7.2 foot-pounds, so don't over tighten them. You're going to go inside first, and then you'll do the outside. Do it in 2 or 3 different tightening steps. Don't just go for the first one all the way at once. Just hand tighten first, maybe down to like 5 foot-pounds, and then 7 foot-pounds as the last step. After you've got all the bolts torqued down, remember to reconnect your ground wire and this bracket bolt. If you took this one off here on the top right, replace the filler cap, replace this hose and move the cinch bracket all the way down so it's tight. We'll put the decorative piece of plastic back on here, and if you had taken off the VTEC assembly like I did, of course we'll reinstall that with the 310mm bolts and reconnect all these connectors that we undid when we were taking off the VTEC. After you've gotten everything reinstalled, you should clean up all the oil so that you can easily check later if your leak is still happening.